Hey guys, tonight we slip into a story you probably weren't expecting. A story about the strange and forgotten science of artificial life. Imagine it. A midnight workshop, oil lamps flickering, the air thick with smoke and solder. On the bench lies a half-built figure, brass joints waiting to creak, glass eyes staring blankly at the ceiling. It's one of those nights where the line between magic and mechanics seems thin enough to step across. You lean closer, half expecting the thing to breathe. And honestly, you probably won't survive this, at least not with your sleep schedule intact. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop your location and local time in the comments. I love seeing who's drifting off with us from different corners of the world. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge further into this forgotten history where humans, always equal parts dreamer and tinkerer, kept asking the same question. Can we make life, not discover it, not nurture it, but make it piece by piece, spark by spark? The story of artificial life is as old as human curiosity, and as strange as the contraptions people built when they thought they were close. It starts with myths and whispers. The ancients imagined golems of clay, moving dolls, and enchanted statues. They spoke of spirits bound into bodies and craftsmen blessed, or cursed, with power to create companions that were not quite alive but not quite dead. These stories didn't sit neatly in dusty folklore. Instead, they crept into the minds of thinkers who would later trade myths for mechanisms. You can almost picture a medieval scholar muttering, "If clay can walk in a story, maybe brass can walk in my shop." And then there were the legends about statues that supposedly moved. In Greece, Hephaestus, the godsmith, forged golden servants to help around his workshop. Imagine showing up at his forge, clank, hiss, and oh, a glittering automaton politely handing him a hammer. Historians still argue whether stories like that came from exaggerated glimpses of real temple automata, simple, water-powered tricks meant to awe worshippers, or just the human tendency to animate whatever it can't explain. Either way, those stories seeded an obsession. If the gods could make helpers, maybe so could you. Fast forward a little. In medieval Europe, alchemists weren't just mixing powders for gold. Some whispered about the homunculus, a tiny human made from strange recipes sealed in glass flasks. You wouldn't want to sip from those flasks. Trust me. According to the 16th century physician Paracelsus, you needed to bury a jar of semen and horse dung under just the right conditions, and voila! Mini-human. Totally gross, wildly impractical, and most likely invented over too much wine. Still, these ideas shaped how later generations thought of life, as something you could cook, coax, or patch together with the right recipe. The drive wasn't purely superstition. You had philosophers like Aristotle pondering spontaneous generation, insisting that life could bubble up from mud or meat if conditions were right. And in a way, that belief gave confidence to generations of would-be creators. If maggots came from rotting flesh, why not a puppet from rotting broth, or a machine from lightning? A strange logic, sure, but it was the best toolkit they had. Meanwhile, across Asia, inventors weren't just writing myths, they were crafting marvels. In 3rd century China, legend says artificers built humanoid automatons so lifelike they could wink, walk, and even flirt. Historians still debate whether these were actual mechanisms or poetic exaggerations. But let's be real, if you can make a water clock that keeps perfect time, why not sneak in a creepy puppet to impress an emperor? And if you're the unlucky courtier asked to test the machine's handshake, well, good luck keeping your cool. The thread weaves on. These early stories gave humanity both fear and courage. Fear that dabbling too close to creation was blasphemous. Courage that maybe, just maybe, with enough gears or sparks, You could mimic the gods. The fascinating part. Every time culture told a cautionary tale like, "Don't make clay men, they'll go rogue," another tinkerer thought, "Challenge accepted." And here's the kicker. None of this ever fully disappeared. Even today, you scroll past videos of AI chatbots or dancing robots, and the comment section is basically the same as in the 18th century. Half awe, half terror. People joke about the rise of Skynet, or mutter that humanity's playing God. Sound familiar? It should. The conversation has been looping for centuries. So tonight, as you close your eyes, you're stepping into a tradition older than science labs. You're walking through dim workshops and candlelit libraries where myths whispered into gears, and where clay figures and brass dolls carried the weight of human longing. You're following a thread that ties Paracelsus to Turing, a thread woven of equal parts brilliance, delusion, and sheer persistence. And the best part? This is only the beginning. You move deeper into the story, and suddenly the flicker of those oil lamps in the workshop gives way to something older. Darker corners where myths lived long before brass and wires. Before there were laboratories with bubbling glassware, there were fireside tales of figures that came alive from mud, wax, or cloth. Humans always wanted shortcuts to companionship or power, and when your options were a goat, a plough, or a prayer, the idea of building a helper out of clay didn't sound so crazy. The most famous of these tales is the golem of Jewish folklore. Picture a rabbi in 16th century Prague, Rabbi Lowe, shaping a hulking clay figure by lantern light. He inscribes the Hebrew word emet, truth, onto its forehead, and the clay stirs, trembles, and stands. The golem becomes a protector for the Jewish community, silent and strong, until one day it becomes too violent, too unpredictable, and the rabbi has to erase a single letter from its brow, turning emet into met, death. The clay slumps back to lifelessness. It's both a myth of hope and a warning. Control life too much, and it might control you. Historians still argue whether this legend was born from real community fears during times of persecution, or just as a rich metaphor that grew legs in the telling. Either way, the image of a clay giant taught people that artificial life came with both power and risk. But the golem wasn't the only figure moving in the shadows of folklore. Across Europe, you had dolls, mannequins, and effigies that weren't just toys. In some regions, peasants believed you could trap spirits in a figure, protective ones if you were lucky, malicious ones if you weren't. Imagine sewing a cloth doll and realizing the village thinks it's watching them at night. Sleep tight, right? Even today, echoes of that fear show up in the way people still shiver at ventriloquist dummies or porcelain dolls with cracked glass eyes. You know the type, the one you swear just blinked at you. In Greece, centuries earlier, myths described living statues crafted by gods. Hephaestus, the smith of Olympus, built golden handmaidens to help around his forge. Talos, a giant bronze automaton, supposedly patrolled the island of Crete, hurling boulders at invaders. You can almost hear the metallic echo of his footsteps in the surf. Were these just imaginative stories, or were they inspired by temple tricks, statues that moved when priests poured water or pulled hidden levers? Historians still argue whether ancient inventors had the engineering chops for true automata, or whether it was all smoke, mirrors, and poetic exaggeration. The Chinese had their own stories of uncanny figures. The Liezi, a text from around the 3rd century BCE, describes an artificer who created a lifelike automaton that performed before the king. This mechanical man could sing, wink, and bow, until the king, suspicious, ordered it dismantled. Inside were organs, bones, and gears all carved from wood. Was it real? Or was the story a symbolic meditation on craftsmanship? We don't know. But you can imagine the crowd gasping, half believing a wooden man just got stage fright. These myths weren't idle curiosities. They reflected human anxieties about control, about hubris, about the thin line between maker and destroyer. Think of the cautionary stories, the golem running amok, Talos crushed by his own flaw, or enchanted dolls that turned from protective to cursed. Each tale carried a whispered warning. Build life if you dare, but don't be surprised when it bites back. At the same time, myths gave courage to experimenters centuries later. If an artificer in a book could do it, why couldn't a clever craftsman in his workshop? Picture a 17th century tinker, surrounded by gears and candle smoke, muttering. Well, if claymen can walk in a story, maybe brass ones can walk in reality. That's the peculiar power of myths. They didn't just entertain, they planted seeds. And the irony, even modern robotics and AI echo these same tales. Every time someone builds a humanoid robot, there's a headline calling it the new golem, or a video comment warning, don't let it learn emotions or we're doomed. We haven't outgrown the myth, we've just wired it into circuit boards. So as you lie there, drifting towards sleep, imagine yourself in a time when stories were the only laboratory, when whispers of clay giants and wooden singers kept imaginations restless at night. The figures didn't breathe, but they were alive enough to haunt people into centuries of invention. The narrative now glides forward into a world where myth meets meticulous craftsmanship, the ateliers of 18th century Europe, where automata whirred and clicked for kings, courtiers, and curious crowds. You can almost smell the warm polish on brass, the faint tang of oil, the soft scrape of tiny files shaping gears smaller than your fingernail. These workshops were theatres, laboratories, and playgrounds rolled into one, where the line between alive and engineered blurred like candle smoke in a draughty salon. Take Pierre-Jacques Droz, for example, a Swiss watchmaker whose creations weren't just clocks, they were companions, entertainers, and propaganda. His most famous automata, the writer, the musician, and the draftsman, performed astonishing feats. The writer, a mechanical boy, could dip a quill and inscribe custom letters, while the musician played an organ with lifelike gestures. Imagine leaning over the machine, expecting a scratchy note or misaligned letters, only to see perfect penmanship, every movement flowing as if guided by an invisible hand. Historians still argue whether audiences truly believed these machines had minds, or whether the spectacle's magic came entirely from expectation and clever engineering. The public reaction was electric. Imagine a crowded salon in Geneva or Paris, gas lamps flickering, the smell of perfume mingling with the metallic tang of machinery. Nobles leaned forward, jaws slack, whispering, "It moves, like a human." And if you were standing there, you might have done the same, shivering at the uncanny precision. Fringe stories soon emerged. Some claimed the draftsman had a soul transferred from a dead child, or that the musician could compose melodies no human had yet conceived. You chuckle now, but back then, these automata were as eerie as any haunted doll. Clockwork birds were another marvel. You might picture a gilded canary hopping delicately on a perch, its tiny mechanical chest rising and falling in imitation of breath, its beak opening to chirp notes that seemed too precise to be made by springs alone. Some inventors went further, hiding tiny air pumps to simulate breathing and heartbeat, giving the illusion of a living creature. Steam and bellows were their magic wands, brass and springs their incantations. People lined up at royal courts just to hear these birds sing. One critic complained, "It is alive, yet not alive enough to forgive your gaze." In England, similar ingenuity appeared at private philosophical theatres, small rooms where mechanical marvels were demonstrated for paying audiences. You imagine a young tinkerer pulling levers while spectators gasp, thinking the automaton might blink, breathe, or, heaven forbid, think. Secret notebooks recorded mechanisms in excruciating detail, how a spring wound, how a cam rotated to simulate a shrug, how the smallest gear's tooth controlled the illusion of life. Fringe rumours circulated that some machines could mimic emotional responses, though skeptics scoffed. It's gears, not feelings. But there's a philosophical undertone you can't ignore. Thinkers like Descartes had posited the universe itself as a clockwork mechanism. If the cosmos followed predictable laws, why couldn't life? These automata weren't just entertainment, they were experiments in philosophy. If a bird could imitate breathing, if a boy could write a letter, maybe life was a mechanical puzzle waiting to be solved. And, of course, skeptics abounded. Was it mimicry? Or was there some secret vital spark the machines couldn't capture? Historians still argue whether these workshops influenced later electrical and chemical experiments, or whether they remained curiosities, isolated in luxury salons. And there's humour in all this, because these clockwork marvels often performed better than humans expected. Imagine the draftsman pausing mid-letter, a spring slipping, or the musician striking a wrong note. Courtiers, who had come expecting divine precision, would gasp, and the inventor would bow sheepishly, promising. Even perfection needs winding. You can hear the chuckles and whispers. Machines, like humans, had flaws. You, listening now, are part of that audience, not with gas lamps, but with the soft glow of your screen, watching history's clockwork children perform again. And as you drift, remember, these automata were more than toys. They were experiments, questions, and provocations, asking the same thing humans have always asked. What does it take to imitate life so closely that we are both enchanted and unsettled? Electricity crackles into our story now, snapping the gentle hum of gears into sudden, startling life. You lean closer, imagining a lab lit by flickering Leyden jars, the smell of ozone stinging your nostrils, and a corpse, or something very much like it, jerking in response to a scientist's hand. Luigi Galvani had discovered that frog legs twitched when brushed with metal, an odd curiosity that would electrify the imagination of Europe. You shiver because, let's be honest, watching a leg kick itself isn't exactly bedtime material, but it's the same fascination that would drive people to imagine reanimating entire bodies. Galvani's nephew, Giovanni Aldini, took things further. He applied sparks to executed criminals on the gallows, and the result was spectacular. Eyes rolled, jaws clenched, limbs twitched, crowds watched, horrified and mesmerized, as if life itself had been summoned for a moment, only to vanish again. Scholars still argue whether Aldini's demonstrations were genuinely educational or largely theatrical, meant to awe politicians and patrons. Either way, the shows blurred the line between science and spectacle. People whispered that a body could almost be awakened. The experiments inspired rumours, letters, and even poetry. One account tells of a man watching a cadaver's arm raise, and supposedly exclaiming, "It's alive!" before fainting. You can imagine standing there, toes curling, heart hammering, half in wonder and half in fear. Fringe accounts claim the sparks summoned spirits, though that's probably dramatised. Yet the public loved a good shock. Electricity wasn't just a tool, it was a magician's wand. Galvani's work also influenced medical and philosophical thought. If nerves responded to electricity, some reasoned, perhaps the vital spark could be manipulated, quantified, or even recreated. Thinkers debated whether life was purely mechanical or something more mystical. Could a spark jumpstart motion, and would the motion become life? Historians still argue whether these early experiments paved the way for modern electrophysiology, or whether they were simply macabre curiosities. Ephemeral theatre with little scientific yield. Outside Europe, similar fascination existed in Japan and China, though without the same corpse theatrics. Tinkerers experimented with lightning rods, mechanical puppets, and rudimentary batteries, imagining ways to mimic life's subtle rhythms. In salons and laboratories alike, people were obsessed with motion, tiny fingers twitching, eyelids fluttering, even birds hopping as if in a breeze. You almost feel the electric tension yourself, hair standing on end, imagining how quickly a spark could transform stillness into jittering animation. And then, humour creeps in. Some reports suggest Aldini's cadaver demonstrations were accidentally comedic. One nobleman supposedly jumped back so violently that he fell into a mud puddle, exclaiming, "I think he is more alive than I am." Even amid awe and horror, humans can't resist laughing. As you drift with this image, you can see how electricity offered a glimpse of possibility, a way to animate the inanimate, to flirt with creation, and to entertain audiences at the same time. It was a delicate dance between curiosity, fear, and mischief, one that would echo centuries later in Frankenstein novels, mad scientists, and the laboratories of the modern world. Now, imagine a workshop filled with the hiss of steam, brass tubing glinting under oil lamps, and tiny bellows puffing rhythmically as if the figures inside were breathing. Steam and pneumatics became the 18th and 19th century answer to the question, if electricity can animate dead flesh, could mechanical lungs mimic life? You trudge through the oily floorboards, ducking past half-finished automata, each with lungs, bellows, and springs carefully arranged to fake inhalation and exhalation. The smell is faintly metallic, tinged with hot water vapour, a sensory clue that life here is only imitation. Inventors like Jacques de Vaucanson created the famous digesting duck, which ate, digested, and excreted. Well, in the illusion of digestion, people marvelled at the realistic wing flaps, quacking and pecking. You can almost hear the duck snuffling across the table, tiny cogs turning in perfect coordination. Fringe reports suggested that de Vaucanson secretly hid small pneumatic tubes and metal rods inside the duck, while skeptics scoffed that nothing truly lived inside it. Historians still argue whether his creations were primarily engineering marvels or deliberate theatrical hoaxes designed to inspire awe. Then there were human figures, automata with breathing mechanisms, pulsing chests, and carefully balanced heads, often meant to demonstrate medical or philosophical principles. You step closer to see a brass chest expand and contract, an intricate set of bellows pumping rhythmically. The illusion is uncanny. For a moment, you might forget it is all metal and wood. Some workshops even added scented oils to suggest the warmth of a living being. Yes, really. Imagine a steam-powered perfumed humanoid, exuding faint lavender while its brass ribs rise and fall. It wasn't just about mimicry. Engineers, natural philosophers, and showmen wanted to understand the mechanics of life itself. If you could simulate respiration, circulation, and movement with gears and air, perhaps you could crack the code of vitality. Some early texts even described how automata were tested with tiny weights to measure force, springs to calculate tension, and small mercury thermometers to imitate warmth. The borderline obsession with precision makes you wonder if they were scientists, artists, or just over-caffeinated hobbyists. And humour was never far away. One account describes a tinkerer accidentally overpressurizing a lung mechanism, causing a figure's chest to burst comically, wings flapping and head spinning, a mechanical tantrum. The audience reportedly gasped, laughed, and then applauded, because, after all, life imitated not only nature but also slapstick. You trudge further through these workshops, noting the crossover between imagination and reality. Steam, brass, and bellows created figures that breathed without lungs, walked without muscles, and lived without life. It's a clever trick, a mixture of artistry, science, and the enduring human desire to see the inanimate imitate us. And as you settle back, a thought creeps in. The more lifelike the automaton, the more humans wondered not just how it worked, but why they were so fascinated by it. Even today, Robotics and AI carry echoes of these steam and brass illusions. You see humanoid robots pausing as if thinking, mechanical pets moving in surprisingly lifelike ways, and you realize the same questions haunt us. What is life? And can it ever be truly imitated? You slip now into the shadowed corners of Victorian workshops, the faint scent of turpentine and candle smoke guiding you past locked cabinets filled with oddities and half-finished projects. These weren't the grand salons of kings, but private theatres where hobbyists, showmen, and natural philosophers quietly traded gears, chemical recipes, and strange success stories. Here, the curious mingled with the obsessive, and every tinkerer was both experimenter and audience of their own peculiar theatre. In London and Paris, secret societies and scientific clubs often held private demonstrations. Picture a dimly lit room where an automaton stands upon a pedestal, its brass joints glinting, tiny bellows hissing as it lifts a quill or gestures delicately. You'd hear muffled gasps from visitors, the polite coughs of skeptics, and the occasional stifled laugh when a spring misfires. Fringe accounts claimed that some automata were paired with tiny lab-grown organisms or chemical mixtures to mimic warmth and movement, though skeptics argued it was all theatrical deception. Historians still argue whether these private rooms fostered genuine experimentation or were primarily social curiosities designed to impress the right patron. Some hobbyists were downright eccentric. One collector reportedly tried combining automata with living insects, embedding beetles under tiny domes to enhance the illusion of life. Others experimented with clockwork figures that could write short poems or gestures, leaving onlookers both amazed and unsettled. Imagine leaning over to see a brass hand delicately tracing ink onto a page, and wondering, who programmed the motions, the machine or the imagination? Trade in parts and ideas was a kind of secret science economy. Tinkerers exchanged drawings of pneumatic lungs, miniature gears, and chemical recipes, often encoded in obscure shorthand to keep outsiders from replicating their work. You can almost hear the whispering, the scrawled letters sealed in wax. The automaton must move as if alive. Pneumatic control is key. Avoid spectators. The obsessive secrecy gave the work an aura of forbidden knowledge, making success and failure equally tantalizing. And of course, humour persisted. One experimenter noted that a clockwork dancer, intended to bow gracefully, instead tripped on its own gears and somersaulted into a cabinet. Guests reportedly applauded the performance, considering it a happy accident rather than failure. It's a reminder that even when humans tried to control life, or its illusion, had a stubborn way of rebelling. The Victorian obsession wasn't purely entertainment. Many viewed these experiments as steps toward understanding biology, physics, and chemistry in miniature. If a bellows-driven chest could imitate breathing, perhaps there were universal principles to unlock. Mechanism and magic intertwined, feeding each other in a strange loop of inspiration, imitation, and gentle absurdity. And as you imagine the tinkerers bent over their workbenches, you realize secrecy, obsession, and a dash of humour are as much a part of scientific history as equations and patents. Literature soon became the mirror reflecting all these experiments back into culture, and you step into a world where words themselves breathe life into imagination. You can picture dimly lit studies, quills scratching, candles dripping wax onto scattered manuscripts, and the faint scent of ink mixing with musty pages. Stories began to take the eerie marvels of automata and galvanic experiments and twist them into tales that fascinated, warned, and entertained. Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, of course, stands at the forefront. Imagine the young Mary, walking along the windswept cliffs of the English coast, pondering life, death, and the horrifying beauty of her own imagination. Victor Frankenstein, in her narrative, mirrors countless 18th and 19th century tinkerers who tried to animate matter, albeit without electricity arcs and human cadavers in public squares. Shelley's story wasn't just horror, it was a meditation on responsibility, curiosity, and hubris. You can almost feel the storm outside the lab windows, lightning snapping, a mix of fear and exhilaration, just as her fictional experiment comes alive. Scholars still debate whether Shelley intended a critique of science itself or was primarily exploring the psychological and social consequences of creation. But literature didn't stop with Shelley. German Romantic writers, French fabulists, and English Gothic authors all explored artificial life in their stories. Dolls that walked, automata that danced, mechanical birds with hidden hearts, all became metaphors for human desire, control, and, inevitably, failure. Some fringe accounts even describe pamphlets claiming that secret societies were creating mechanical humans, inspiring both terror and fascination among readers. You shiver because the line between fact and fiction blurred. A story in print could convince someone that life had already been mechanically mastered. Interestingly, literature often served as a laboratory of the imagination. Writers tested ideas that engineers or chemists might later attempt in real life. One might argue that Shelley's creation of the monster inspired more than moral contemplation. It gave future scientists and hobbyists a template, a symbolic framework for experiments involving galvanism, chemistry, or clockwork. You can almost hear a student of science whispering, "If Victor can do it in prose, why not in a lab?" And humour persists even here. Some early readers speculated that Frankenstein's monster had mundane quirks, like spilling chemicals, misplacing limbs, or sneezing when it caught a draught. You imagine someone reading aloud in a candlelit room, pausing to suppress laughter at the idea of a monster struggling with laboratory manners. Even the most terrifying stories had room for levity, a human touch in the machinery of fiction. So, as you drift in thought, you see that literature didn't merely reflect artificial life, it incubated it, amplified it, and asked the question humans have been asking for centuries. If we can imagine life in ink and paper, can we someday coax it from brass conchiesius clay or chemical broth? And somewhere in that overlap of imagination and experimentation, the story continues, threading from past myths into the labs and workshops yet to come. You step now into the philosophical currents that underpinned all this tinkering, where thinkers tried to explain not just how life moved, but what it meant to move at all. Picture a dim study, a globe spinning slowly on its stand, parchment covered in careful handwriting, quills poised for reflection. Descartes had famously proposed that animals, and by extension, automata, were complex machines. In his view, they move through predictable, mechanical laws, devoid of consciousness or soul. You trudge along with him in thought, imagining a rooster, a horse, or even a tiny automaton, all following invisible gears and levers rather than feelings or desires. This mechanist philosophy resonated deeply with the inventors and hobbyists of the time. If life could be reduced to motion, perhaps it could be replicated. You can almost see the gears in their minds clicking alongside their physical gears, each turn a philosophical as well as mechanical experiment. Historians still argue whether Descartes intended to inspire scientific inquiry or simply to delineate the boundary between humans and animals. But the impact on artificial life enthusiasts was undeniable. Other thinkers expanded the metaphor. Leibniz imagined a universe of perfect pre-programmed machines, each element acting according to precise laws. To him, living organisms were nothing more than extraordinarily intricate clockwork, predictable if observed closely. You lean back and picture a laboratory in Paris or Berlin, an automaton lifting its hand in precise rhythm, as if obeying a cosmic blueprint. Even the tiniest gear seemed to echo the philosopher's larger, cosmic machine. Yet not all philosophers agreed. Vitalists, for example, insisted that life carried something irreducible, an élan vital, that no amount of machinery could imitate. Imagine a heated debate in a candlelit salon. One scholar demonstrates a clockwork bird. The other insists it cannot truly breathe without an invisible spark of life. Fringe reports suggest that sometimes these debates ended in wagers. Could a machine be made to imitate a heartbeat convincingly? Could a brass automaton be alive enough to fool a stranger? You shiver because the line between earnest argument and playful blasphemy was always razor thin. Humour sneaks in, naturally. One philosopher reportedly demonstrated a mechanical frog, then watched as it jumped off the table during a lecture, startling the audience and ruining his notes. Laughter echoed through the room, proof that even precise reasoning could not fully control the chaos of imitation life. By the end of the day, or night, you understand that philosophy provided both map and compass. Mechanist and vitalist ideas fueled workshops, guided automaton design, and framed debates about what counted as life. And you realise every bellows, every gear, every spark in those early laboratories carried centuries of reflection, speculation, and, yes, a fair bit of human stubbornness. Your journey now drifts into the microscopic, the murky waters where spontaneous generation and early microbiology collided. You trudge across dimly lit labs with glass flasks and covered dishes, the faint aroma of vinegar and boiled broth hanging in the air. Experimenters were obsessed with whether life could arise from nothing, whether a pile of rotting meat or stagnant water could, under the right conditions, give birth to wriggling, invisible organisms. And for someone leaning over the table at midnight, it was simultaneously fascinating and a little gross. Back in the 17th century, Francesco Redi challenged the idea of spontaneous generation with a simple, elegant experiment. He placed meat in open jars and sealed jars, observing the presence or absence of maggots. The result? Life didn't appear in sealed jars. You imagine peering into his containers, watching wriggling larvae emerge only where flies could access, and thinking, maybe life isn't as easy to manufacture as alchemists hoped. Historians still argue whether Redi's work fully dismantled the notion of spontaneous generation at the time, or simply sparked more subtle debates about unseen forces at work. Meanwhile, Antony van Leeuwenhoek peered through his handcrafted microscopes. Discovering a teeming microcosm in drops of water, you shiver as you picture his astonishment. Tiny organisms wriggling like unseen dancers, entirely invisible to the naked eye. To the experimenters of the time, it was proof of nature's hidden vivacity. Fringe observers whispered that perhaps these microbe dancers were miniature automata, or spirits captured by the lens, a misinterpretation that only amplified public fascination and fear. Debates raged over whether life required a spark, a vital essence, or merely favourable conditions. Alchemists and chemists tested broth, soil, and water, seeking to induce life in controlled settings. Some claimed success, others failure, and all the while spectators and scientists alike pondered the implications. Could a carefully prepared soup become alive overnight? Was life just chemistry waiting for the right nudge? Scholars still argue whether these early observations were misread, or if they hinted at deeper truths that modern biology would only unravel centuries later. Even in their earnestness, experimenters couldn't avoid the occasional absurdity. One account tells of a scientist who, believing he had successfully created microorganisms in a flask, accidentally introduced a stray fly egg, leading to proof that life spontaneously arose, until careful examination revealed the intruder. You chuckle because the chaos of real life always finds a way to mimic or mock the attempt to control it. As you lean back, imagine all those tiny wriggles under the lens, moving invisibly yet profoundly influencing thought. The question of life's origin, simple, mechanical, or spiritual, hung in every whispered debate, every laboratory notebook, every microscope slide. And you realise the curiosity that led humans to coax life from broth or clay is the same curiosity that eventually drives us to peek into cells, mix chemicals, and ask again. What makes something truly alive? You trudge now into the messy, chemical side of artificial life, where early scientists tried to coax cell-like blobs into existence with little more than jars, broth, and boundless patience. Picture a cluttered laboratory, glass beakers fogged with condensation, wooden stirrers sloshing murky liquids, and the faintly sweet smell of fermented compounds hanging in the air. These experiments were crude, chaotic, but utterly captivating. Scientists and hobbyists alike sought to recreate the simplest forms of life in hopes of understanding the building blocks of all living things. Jean-Baptiste van Helmont, back in the 17th century, had already suggested that life could arise spontaneously from everyday materials. He famously claimed that a dirty shirt left with grains of wheat could produce mice. You pause and imagine opening that cage or cloth bundle, wondering if it's a proto-mouse or just an overactive imagination. Historians still argue whether Van Helmont actually believed in this, or if his accounts were exaggerations to please curious aristocrats. Either way, the concept stuck. If mice could arise from shirts, why not more complex life from chemical mixtures? Later, early chemists tried protocell experiments, tiny droplets of lipid or protein that could mimic cell membranes, swell, divide, and react to stimuli. You lean closer to the flask, imagining microscopic spheres bouncing gently, wobbling like children in a puddle. Some fringe reports even claim these blobs exhibited behaviour, moving toward light or recoiling from a touch, though skeptics insisted it was merely physical reactions to temperature, light, or vibration. The illusion of life was intoxicating. And then there were the Petri dish experiments in the late 19th century, when bacterial colonies offered both promise and frustration. Some pioneers tried combining simple chemicals to create self-organizing structures, hoping for life to emerge from broth without any pre-existing organisms. Many failed. Some succeeded in producing semi-stable blobs, and all contributed to a slowly emerging understanding of biochemistry. You shiver at the thought of the gooey experiments, the endless notes, the persistent hope that maybe, just maybe, life could be synthesized. Humour wasn't absent, of course. One early experimenter recounted a blob that escaped its dish by clinging to a tweezers and sliding across the table, prompting a colleague to declare it the first self-aware life form. Much to everyone's amusement, you can picture the chuckles, the shaking of heads, the mixture of awe and absurdity that permeated the lab. Through all this, the message is clear. Humans have always tried to reduce life to its simplest components, whether for curiosity, understanding, or the thrill of creation. Even the messy, improbable blobs in glass flasks were part of the same quest that began with golems and automata, to see if life could be coaxed, guided, or mimicked, and to feel that strange, shivery wonder when it almost succeeds. Now you wander into the hybrid world where art, alchemy, and science collided, a place where creativity and curiosity blurred. Imagine dim studios filled with half-finished automata, jars of strange liquids, and sketches pinned to the walls, some depicting fantastical creatures with mechanical limbs. Artists and occultists partnered with tinkerers, combining aesthetics, chemistry, and mechanics to produce artifacts that were part visual delight, part proto-science experiment. You can almost hear the gentle scrape of chisels, the hiss of small furnaces, and the occasional startled gasp when an automaton unexpectedly moves. In Renaissance Italy, it was common for painters and sculptors to collaborate with inventors. Leonardo da Vinci, for instance, conceptualized mechanical knights and intricate automatons that could raise arms, move their heads, and even sit down. Historians still argue whether these were ever fully realized, or if the sketches were primarily intellectual exercises. But the level of detail in his notebooks suggests serious intent. You imagine a brass-armoured knight, wires and gears hidden beneath its gilded surface, moving slowly through a studio, a silent performance for curious apprentices. Alchemists contributed too, often in unexpected ways. They experimented with chemical reactions not merely to create gold, but to simulate life's motion or even mimic bodily processes. One famous figure claimed that by combining certain mineral compounds, he could make small, dancing spirits in jars of liquid. You shiver slightly imagining these tiny figures quivering and spinning, half illusion, half chemical reaction. Fringe reports suggest some alchemists believed they could capture the essence of life itself in a vial, a tantalizing, if morally questionable pursuit. Collaboration extended to secret societies and salons, where artists, philosophers, and hobbyist scientists traded sketches, chemical formulas, and mechanical diagrams. You can picture the whispered conversations. "I've created a miniature automaton that can breathe when air is applied. Watch." Notes were exchanged in cryptic code to protect ideas, while patrons and curious onlookers marvelled at the apparent miracles. Humour, of course, slipped in. Some automata misbehaved. A mechanical dancer skirt would catch a lever, or a clockwork bird would crash into a painting. Laughter punctuated awe, reminding everyone that even in experiments, chaos could reign. These collaborations also blurred the boundaries between art and science. Automata weren't just machines. They were aesthetic performances, chemical curiosities, and philosophical statements all at once. By blending visual appeal with mechanical motion, inventors explored fundamental questions. Could life be simulated? Could beauty and function coexist in a form that fooled both the eye and the mind? And as you imagine these workshops, candlelight flickering on brass and copper, you realize that creativity itself was a kind of life, a guiding force in the quest to understand and imitate it. The underlying lesson carries forward. Curiosity knows no discipline. Tinkerers, alchemists, and artists were united by a shared desire to coax life from unlikely places, combining observation, imagination, and a touch of mischief. And as you settle further into the story, you feel yourself drifting alongside them, witnesses to their eccentric triumphs and occasional comical failures. Now your path winds into the electrical laboratories of the 19th century, where sparks flew not just from candles and furnaces, but from actual currents of electricity. Picture a dimly lit room, wires snaking across benches, Leyden jars perched like glass monsters ready to discharge, and faint ozone stinging the air. Experimenters were obsessed with the tantalizing idea that electricity, nature's invisible force, could animate matter, bridging the gap between lifeless mechanism and living organism. You shiver a little because, honestly, watching a cadaver's limbs twitch under high-voltage stimulation is a strange bedtime image. Giovanni Aldini, following in his uncle Galvani's footsteps, electrified human and animal cadavers in public demonstrations, eliciting movements that were both fascinating and horrifying. Limbs jerked, jaws clenched, and eyes appeared to roll in recognition, if only briefly. Spectators were alternately terrified and awestruck. Scholars still argue whether Aldini's work was primarily scientific, educational, or simply theatrical spectacle designed to impress patrons and influence political elites. Either way, the effect on the public imagination was profound. People began to associate life itself with electric energy. Meanwhile, Michael Faraday experimented with electromagnetic forces, constructing crude devices that could mimic motion or respond to electrical stimulation. Some inventors claimed to have created electric fish that twitched when powered, while others reportedly tried to simulate heartbeat-like rhythms in mechanical constructs. You imagine the flicker of sparks and the whine of coils, a symphony of electricity that almost breathed. Fringe rumours suggested some workshops were embedding tiny souls into machines using electrical currents. Pure speculation. But it shows how imagination and experiment intertwined. The era also saw the rise of the galvanic imagination in literature. Frankenstein had already captured the public imagination, And now, with real-life sparks leaping across lab tables, readers and experimenters alike were eager to explore whether the dead or the mechanical could be made to move. You might imagine an inventor in a candlelit attic, wires trailing to a brass automaton, muttering, "If electricity moves a frog's leg, why not a human hand?" Humour persists even amid horror. One account recalls an automaton accidentally completing a movement meant to simulate respiration so vigorously that its arms flailed, knocking over tools and alarming the assistants. Laughter punctuated the terror, reminding all involved that even the most precise electrical experiments carried a mischievous unpredictability. These experiments fundamentally shifted how humanity thought about life and mechanism. Electricity became a symbol of animation, a bridge from theory to movement. You imagine the faint hum of current in your ears, the smell of metal and ozone, and the thrill of watching a lifeless form twitch, as though infused with a spark of vitality. The same curiosity that fueled medieval golems and Renaissance automata now pulsed through the veins of laboratories, shaping the modern dream of artificial life. Your journey now drifts into the eerie laboratories of the early 20th century, where science begins to flirt with life at a cellular and chemical level. You trudge through rooms cluttered with glassware, microscopes, and metal instruments. The air tinged with formaldehyde and the faint chemical scent of culture media. Here, researchers are no longer content with mechanical imitation. They aim to coax life itself from its basic ingredients, manipulating cells, proteins, and chemical reactions. One of the most famous early pioneers was Alexis Carrel, a French surgeon who, working in the 1910s and 1920s, claimed to keep cells alive indefinitely in culture. You can almost see him peering through the microscope, adjusting flasks, and murmuring instructions to a team of assistants. Historians still argue whether Carrel truly achieved immortality for his cells, or whether his meticulous techniques were misinterpreted, but his claims inspired immense fascination, and not a little ethical concern. Fringe stories circulated that Carrel's cultures could think, or at least remember, the care given to them, though this is clearly an embellishment. Meanwhile, biochemists explored the boundaries of life by assembling the essential components of cells in vitro. Imagine swirling a flask of proteins, sugars, and salts, watching tiny droplets coalesce, swell, and divide, behavior that eerily mirrors that of living cells. Some early chemists reported seeing behaviors like motion, aggregation, or reaction to light and touch. You shiver at the thought, life being teased into existence by careful manipulation of chemicals, a microcosmic echo of the grand automata of centuries past. The early experiments with artificial life were not only scientific, but also philosophical. If cells could survive, reproduce, or respond in controlled environments, what did that imply about the nature of life itself? Could it be reduced to chemistry, or was something essential still missing? Historians still argue whether these experiments truly illuminated the secrets of life, or whether they simply created sophisticated imitations that fooled the eye and inspired human imagination. Humour crept in too. Some accounts describe a tiny colony of protocells that escaped a dish, spreading across the bench in a slow, crawling wave. Lab assistants reportedly shouted in mock horror, while the head scientist quipped, "They've learned to sneak out. Perhaps they're smarter than us after all." Even in these meticulous, sterile environments, life, or its imitation, insisted on a little chaos. As you settle back, consider the continuum of fascination: clay golems, brass automata, galvanic cadavers, steam-driven lungs, and now, living cells in flasks. Each represents an attempt to imitate, to understand, and to manipulate life. And as you drift, you feel the same tension that has driven humans for centuries: awe, curiosity, fear, and the irresistible urge to see if life can be made, coaxed, or animated in ways that both delight and unsettle. The story now coils around the dawn of digital and computational approaches to life, where circuits and code begin to simulate the behaviors of organisms rather than attempting to create them physically. You trudge through the glow of cathode ray tubes, the click of relays, and the faint aroma of hot resistors and solder. Here, life becomes algorithmic, patterns, probabilities, and rules replace gears, bellows, and chemical flasks. You feel a subtle thrill, knowing that what was once mechanical and chemical is now abstracted into numbers and sequences, yet still evokes the same questions about imitation and vitality. In the 1940s and 50s, pioneers like John von Neumann and Alan Turing imagined self-replicating machines and computational automata. You can picture von Neumann's drawings, lines and arrows depicting machines that could build copies of themselves given raw materials, a theoretical playground of life as mechanism. Historians still argue whether these thought experiments were meant as purely mathematical exercises or as proto-biological hypotheses, but they undeniably shifted the landscape, inspiring later work in robotics, artificial intelligence, and artificial life simulations. Fringe stories suggest early programmers even tried feeding their algorithms tiny simulated environments, observing how they would evolve, almost like digital petri dishes. Meanwhile, cyberneticists like Norbert Wiener framed living organisms as feedback systems, blurring the line between biology and machinery. Imagine a mechanical creature responding to its environment, adjusting behavior according to sensory input, a little like the clockwork figures of centuries before, but now infused with computational thinking. The analogy is irresistible. Life as information, behavior as algorithm, and adaptation as a rule set rather than a mystery of divine spark. You shiver slightly because even the most abstract simulations echo the same fascination with imitation that centuries of automata provoked. Humour surfaces naturally. One lab anecdote recounts a program intended to evolve in simulated space, only to produce repetitive, nonsensical patterns, prompting a researcher to declare, "It has all the intelligence of a confused duck." Even in the digital realm, life, or imitation thereof, retains a touch of unpredictability. The rise of computer simulations, artificial neural networks, and robotic models in this period illustrates a shift. Scientists are no longer just creating life, they are observing, imitating, and experimenting with its logic. You can almost feel the pulse of electricity in these early computers, the same awe and curiosity that once surrounded brass automata and galvanic experiments now mirrored in lines of code. And as you settle deeper into the story, you realize that whether gears, sparks, chemicals, or algorithms, humanity's quest to understand and replicate life is continuous, evolving with each century's tools and imagination. You now enter the present-day frontier, where artificial life merges with robotics, synthetic biology, and AI. The labs hum softly with computer fans, the faint scent of sterilized plastic, and the quiet beep of sensors monitoring miniature robots and cell cultures. You can almost feel the vibration of servo motors as they move, the whir of drone-like machines, and the hum of incubators keeping synthetic cells alive. Here, centuries of imagination, philosophy, and experimentation converge into real-world manifestations of artificial life. Synthetic biologists now engineer minimal cells with only the genes necessary for survival, coaxing them to replicate, respond to stimuli, and even evolve in controlled environments. It's the modern echo of Van Helmont's mice and Carroll's immortal cells, yet far more precise. Historians still argue whether these achievements constitute the creation of life or merely the manipulation of existing life forms. Fringe enthusiasts speculate wildly. Some imagine fully programmable organisms as if life itself were code. You shiver because the boundary between biological reality and human design is thinner than ever. Robotics and AI add another dimension. Humanoid robots now walk, gesture, and interact with humans, sometimes convincingly enough to trigger empathy or confusion. Small biohybrid robots incorporate muscle cells grown in the lab, producing movements that are simultaneously mechanical and living. You imagine a tiny robot with beating tissue wings, navigating a miniature obstacle course, blurring the lines between the animate and inanimate. It's a continuation of our centuries-old curiosity, except now the stakes are ethical and philosophical as well as technical. Humour is still present. Some experimental robots misstep or overreact to sensors, prompting researchers to laugh and recalibrate, recalling centuries of automata tripping over their own gears or ducking off tables. Even at the cutting edge, imitation life retains a human touch of unpredictability and amusement. As you drift through these labs, it becomes clear that the quest for artificial life is more than entertainment, exhibition, or curiosity. It is an enduring experiment in understanding what life is, how it functions, and how humans perceive and interact with it. From clay golems and clockwork birds to computational automata and synthetic cells, the fascination is continuous, the desire to imitate, comprehend, and sometimes play God. And as you watch a tiny artificial heart pulse in a lab, you realize the centuries-old question persists. What does it truly mean to be alive? You settle now into the quiet reflection of this long journey, the dim glow of monitors and the faint hum of incubators providing a soothing backdrop. Centuries of human curiosity converge in your mind, clay golems kneading their non-existent muscles, brass automata breathing with pneumatic lungs, frogs twitching under electric currents, and tiny artificial cells dividing in sterile dishes. Each experiment, each workshop, each laboratory has contributed a layer to the ongoing story of humanity's desire to imitate life. Even now, the pursuit of artificial life raises questions that echo past debates. Philosophers, ethicists, and scientists ponder whether life is reducible to chemistry, mechanics, or algorithms, or whether some ineffable spark persists that defies replication. You imagine the lively discussions that continue today in quiet labs, university seminar rooms, and conference halls. Historians still argue whether our ancestors glimpsed the principles of life, or merely delighted in the thrill of imitation. The boundary between imitation and creation remains tantalizingly thin, a mirror reflecting our fascination, ambition, and hubris. Synthetic biology pushes the boundaries further. Scientists engineer organisms that respond to environmental cues, reprogram microbes to perform useful functions, and even design entirely new genetic sequences. Robotics and AI contribute movement, interaction, and a convincing semblance of awareness. Fringe enthusiasts dream wildly: artificial pets, programmable cells, even consciousness simulated in silicon. Humour persists in the laboratories too. Robots misinterpret commands, cell cultures escape, and researchers chuckle at the delightful chaos of trying to create life without it creating itself in unpredictable ways. And you can't help noticing the continuum of human engagement. Every generation has tried to imitate life, whether through myth, automata, electricity, chemicals, or computation. You see patterns of awe, curiosity, occasional horror, and irrepressible humour threading through time. You reflect on the tactile, sensory, and philosophical dimensions, the smell of oil in workshops, the crackle of electricity, the soft hum of incubators, and the thrill of seeing motion where once there was none. As you close your eyes, you feel the centuries converge. The pursuit of artificial life is not merely a scientific endeavour, but a mirror of humanity itself. Our desire to understand, to imitate, to create, and to marvel. And in that quiet, you realise that this fascination is far from over. It pulses quietly in labs, minds, and imaginations around the world. The story isn't finished. It merely waits for the next spark, the next invention, the next curious mind willing to ask, can life be made, and what does it mean if it is? Now, Soften your gaze and let your breathing slow. Imagine the workshops, laboratories, and studios fading into twilight. The faint hum of machines and fans blending with the gentle rhythm of your own heartbeat. The echoes of centuries of experimentation linger only as whispers, shadows of curiosity and imagination that once filled spaces with both awe and chaos. Each spark, gear, and chemical reaction recedes, leaving a quiet reflection on the human urge to understand life itself. The golems need no more. Brass automata pause in mid-motion, and microscopes reveal only the calm stillness of slides. You feel the pulse of curiosity gradually dissolve into a serene understanding. The quest to imitate life is not only about creation, but about wonder, contemplation, and a playful dialogue with possibility. Even the odd mishaps, the humour of flailing limbs, runaway blobs, or misbehaving robots, now seem like gentle laughter from the past, reminding you that learning and fascination have always been intertwined with joy and surprise. Let your thoughts drift to the present. Tiny cells in incubators, digital simulations humming quietly, robotic movements precise yet occasionally whimsical. Sense the continuity, the thread connecting past imagination to present endeavour, and let it ease into the background hum of your mind. There is comfort in knowing that human curiosity is persistent, patient, and imaginative, and that the spark of wonder has travelled across centuries to meet you here. Now, allow the images to fade fully. The labs are empty, the automata at rest, and the world of artificial life settles into quiet sleep. As do you. Feel yourself floating gently on the rhythm of your own breath. The curiosity of ages whispering soft reassurances. All is calm, all is safe. And with that, you drift further into dreamland, the mysteries of life tucked gently alongside your imagination, ready to resume another day.